I'd actually like to start, if you can empty your hands of objects and take a comfortable, upright, seated position, and if you feel comfortable, close your eyes for a moment. That'd be great. If you don't want to close your eyes, if you at least kind of turn your attention inward, kind of keep your eyes downcast, and feel your body in the chair, or whatever you're sitting or standing upon. Feel your head in this interior sky. Feel your breath doing its thing in between those two poles. Just coming in, going out of its own accord. Just notice your breath for a couple of minutes. Can you just watch your breath? Can you watch your breath without interpreting or trying to change or control? Just watch your breath do what it does. Okay, take a deep breath. If you want to stretch, you can stretch. Just don't hit your neighbor. There's chairs in front if you want to sit up front. So, what I want to do this afternoon is offer some ways of thinking about the big picture of what permaculture is or could be, what it is, what our work is in this time in history, perhaps. And to me, at its essence, it's about mimicking ecosystems. So I want to reflect, I want to reframe, I want to illuminate. Way back in the day, when I was a youngster, I decided to go to graduate school. And I had taken my permaculture course with Bill Mollison in 1981, the second course he taught in the U.S. And in '83, I decided I wanted to be a designer. I wanted to go to graduate school. I wanted to learn how to design ecosystems. So I went to colleges, universities all over the eastern seaboard. I went to ecology departments, landscape architecture departments, and agriculture departments. And I would say to the professors and deans or whatever, whoever I met there, I'd say, I want to learn how to design ecosystems. Can you help me learn how to do that? And the responses I got were things like, and then one world-renowned ecologist, who shall remain nameless, very angrily said to me, "You can't design ecosystems, that's impossible!" And I was like, okay. And outwardly, I was like very polite and like, okay, thank you very much. You know, I hear you. But inside, I was saying, huh? I'm sorry, but we design ecosystems every day, and as ecosystems, they suck. Because a parking lot is an ecosystem. There's blue-green algae on the surface of that pavement, photosynthesizing, and there's a whole food web on that pavement at the microscopic level and beyond. And there's fungi eating the crumbs and the spilled coffee in the cars. You know, and you open your door and a fly flies in, and then you close the door and drive 50 or 100 miles, and you move that fly, and who knows what that does to the genetics of the fly population or something, right? There's no escaping that is an ecosystem. And so is this suburban landscape here, these suburban landscapes. So is what we're doing, you know, we're contributing right now, I assume, if we're on the grid, we are contributing to creating this landscape in Kentucky, throughout Appalachia, of mountaintop removal coal mining. Because we're using electricity right now. It's coming from the grid. We're helping create that. We are part of that landscape in the Appalachians. You and I, right now, in a permaculture gathering. You know, if we eat food that's grown in the Midwest, which most of us do, we're helping create the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We're designing ecosystems. Are we aware of that? Because we don't know it or we don't care, we do a poor job of designing ecosystems. So the key point here is that the way we frame our reality, it doesn't determine the paradigm. That is our paradigm. Is it ecosystem design or not, what we're doing? That's our paradigm. The challenge is that the way we define a problem determines the kind of solutions we're going to find for it. In permaculture, the saying is, the problem is the solution. Well, that has multiple meanings. But if you define a problem as, I have a client come to me and they say, I want you to tell me how to grow as many apples as possible on this land, then the realm of design solutions that I can offer is limited by the way they've defined that. I want you to tell me how to grow as much fruit as possible. That's got a broader set of possible design outcomes, but it's still limited. As much food as possible, that's even broader, right? So the way we define the problem will determine the solutions that we develop. The problem is that we most often define our problems unconsciously. We're not aware of how we're limiting our problem definition, our goal statement, our questions, which, just so you all know, a problem, a question, and an intention are three ways of saying the same thing. Right? If you have a hard time defining a problem, ask a question or state a goal. If you're having a hard time stating a goal, define a problem or ask a question. And around the circle there, right? Can help you to get unstuck in your process, having that understanding. So we're often defining our goals, our problems, our questions unconsciously. And as a result, we're getting solutions that don't necessarily do what we want them to do, because we're not aware of how we're defining things. And so much of this comes down to deep cultural conditions. Now, way back in 1990 or so, way back, in 1990 or so, I came across an article which I've lost, and I've lost the reference, but I think I have the numbers right. It was an early neuroscience article. They probably have better numbers now, but I haven't been able to find something comparable. So I'm just going to go with the old numbers, just to make a point. And it may or may not be accurate in terms of the numbers, but the point is still accurate. Okay? What this article said was that the human brain, every second, can process 8 billion bits of information a second. So a bit being a single on or off in digital parlance. Right? 8 bits equals a byte. So each of our brains is processing 1 gigabyte of data right now. Every second. 1 gigabyte. And that includes skin temperature on our whole skin, sense of the texture of whatever our skin is touching, our proprioceptive awareness of where our different muscles and bones are in relation to each other, our heart rate, oxygen content of the blood throughout our whole body, how our food is digesting, what I'm saying, what you're hearing that you're not aware you're hearing from the environment around you. All that we are all processing 1 gigabyte a second. But we're only aware, consciously aware of 2,000 bits per second. And that is equal to 1/4,000,000th of the data we're processing. Our consciousness is 1/4,000,000th of the total data. And if you look at this dot here, I don't know what the resolution of this machine is that's projecting the image, but this is certainly dozens of pixels. And I'll guarantee you there's not 4 million pixels on this whole image. So this is many, many, many times bigger than 1/4,000,000. So what you're aware of in this second is a teeny tiny fraction of what your body is processing for data. That, my friends, is the frame. If you grew up in a household where it was very clear that psychic phenomena were unacceptable to talk about, then you have probably trained yourself to not experience psychic phenomena. And that is the vast majority of us, I would imagine. Some of us can't help experiencing psychic phenomena. Others of us are open to it. Some of us are totally like, oh, that is of the devil, and we will not go there at all. And, Right? So, what are we aware of? That is teeny part of what we actually could know if we had the awareness. So what is that frame? That frame is our perceived world, is what we're aware of. It's our reality. It's a way to simplify the vast quantity of data that our body and mind is processing in any moment so that we can have some organized sense of what's going on in the world. That means there's a necessary adaptation for survival. Because if we were conscious of all that stuff, most of us would kind of go nuts. We wouldn't be able to function very well in the world. So that frame is really a critical piece of being able to function. But that frame is also our self-sense. It's our identity. It's our ego. It's who we think we are, even though it's only the tiniest part of who we actually are. So beware your frames. Beware the frames. Beware the frames. So let's apply this a little bit, shall we? How are we defining the problem that we are trying to solve with permaculture or whatever you want to call it? We can look at it as humanity's quintuple threat, let's say. We can say, okay, we've got population growth, definitely an issue. We've got 7.8 billion and growing rapidly. Definitely a problem. We've also got global climate chaos, and there's a frame for you. Climate chaos or climate change or global warming. Global warming sounds like a nice bathtub. I can enjoy that. Climate change, you know the phrase climate change was invented by a right-wing organization to help reduce people's concern about the issue. Climate chaos is a little more accurate, I think, than climate change or global warming as a frame to call this. And the Republicans have gotten very good at using neurolinguistic programming and other framing strategies to win battles before they've even begun by framing things in certain ways. The Democrats don't have they're very unclear on this. They're getting there, but it's ridiculous. So anyway, then we've got the sixth great extinction that we are all creating. And then we've got, oh yeah, peak oil. That. Or maybe it's peak everything, according to some people, right? And then there's that little thing of the explosion of debt. Small problem. All right, looking at these five, just these five, how does it feel in your body? How does that, to realize we've got five huge problems here, how does that feel? Does that feel good to you, or is that a hopeful problem definition to you? You feeling a little bit cringy inside, perhaps?
You get kind of fight or flight feeling, yeah.
Bingo. Yes. Yes. Fight, flight, and freeze are three of the four F's of the reptilian brain response to the world. The other one begins with an F, but I won't say the word.
Okay.
Right? All right, let's shift that problem definition and say, look, if you think about historical times, Alma, David and Holmgren here, we've got this exponential curve here that for millennia, human population was low but still growing, and then kaboom, we had cheap energy come along, and we have this industrial ascent, energy and resource use increasing, population, pollution and waste production, all these things increasing, and debt and money supply increasing at an exponential rate. This is one behavior of a system. If you drop one bacteria into a petri dish, a sterile petri dish of food for that bacterium, it will double it will exponentially grow until it uses up all the resources in that petri dish, and then the population will crash. Guess what? We're doing the same thing. We're just bacteria in a frickin' petri dish. Because resource limits have been taken off, and we're boom. That's how it works, right? And we have these options as possible scenarios for the future. And as David Holmgren says, you know, the real issue of our age is how are we going to make a graceful and ethical descent from that energy peak? Right? And permaculture is about this regenerative descent. It's not about sustainability. It's about how do we descend from this peak while we regenerate the planet. Sustainability is the issue that our grandchildren will face, and that their grandchildren will be able to say, yes, we've been sustainable since our grandparents' time. We have to get to a point where sustainability is possible, because we can't sustain where we're at. This idea that we can sustain our level of population and resource use by investing heavily in renewables is a bunch of hooey, in my opinion. It's about as realistic as infinite growth on a finite planet. Because at the moment, we are decreasing carrying capacity. And sooner or later, that's going to catch up with us. Hopefully, we'll catch up to that and do this rather than... Right? So, these problem definitions are both true. They're just different frames. One is overwhelming. The other one, I find a little more empowering. The second one. This one is disintegrated. This one is coherent and integrating. It puts us in our place. We are an ecological species behaving like any species does. It's natural what's going on, folks. We're not bad. It's just what happens to a species when limits are released. Right? This puts us into reactive fear, fight or flight, or freeze, or the other one. This one gives the possibility of something visionary, something based in love, problem focused, creative, actionable, survival energy is what I get out of the first one. This one is like, oh, what are the possibilities here? Right? So how we frame the problem has a huge impact on what we're doing, what we think we're doing, and how we feel about it, and therefore how energized we are, how motivated we are, how functional we are. Because if I'm reacting out of fear, don't get me wrong, fear is actually a very adaptive thing. It's a very useful thing. It's been around for millennia in the limbic system, the mammalian group of organisms. I'm very grateful for my fear. It saved my butt a number of times, right? But when we're repressing the fear and pushing it away, and it actually controls our behavior unconsciously, that's when it's a problem, right? I don't want to be there. I want to be using my fear in a creative, actionable, functional way. So, like I said, it's not about sustainability. It's about regenerative descent, and the real issue of our age is how we can make a graceful and ethical descent from the energy period. Essentially, what Bill Mollison and David Holmgren said in their first permaculture book, Permaculture 1, was, we seek to recreate the Garden of Eden, and why not? As they continued that paragraph, they said, all it will take is the application of human will and ingenuity. Right? We know most of what we need to know to begin heading that direction in a big way. It's not rocket science. It's more complex than rocket science. They have equations. The rocket scientists do. We don't have equations. We've got to figure this out. And the great thing is that clothing will be optional. All right, so recreate the Garden of Eden. Why not? So, I have an issue with the word permaculture, and I have since the beginning. I have more than one issue, actually. Permanent? Permanent? Anyone here a Buddhist? You know? Nothing is permanent. It's also one of the purest kinds of jargon there is, because the word doesn't really mean what we're trying to say. I prefer to call it ecological culture design. Culture is our species' primary adaptive mechanism. Our bodies are still evolving physiologically, but that takes a long time. Cultures adapt much more quickly, or they can, supposedly. As an anthropological word, use the word culture, not like culture as the opera. Right? So we have to speed up cultural evolution through conscious design. That is what the situation is causing us to have to do. The structure of the reality we face is that if we're going to thrive, or maybe even survive, we have to consciously design our cultures. And they are evolving as whole systems, cultures are, and therefore we have to design them as whole systems. If that's true, then what the heck is a culture? We have to understand what it is we're designing. I have a model. Remember, though, please, the map is not the territory. The model is not the reality. I began inventing this model when I was 17 before I even heard about permaculture. It involves, the first key point here is that if you imagine this whole screen as the world of nature, this bubble, everything inside this circle is the world of culture. Culture is part of nature. Nature evolved to become human. We are natural. The first piece of the culture pie is resources. These are a perceptual phenomenon. If you perceive something as a resource, you'll start using it. If you don't perceive it as a resource, you won't. This is part of the insight of permaculture. Right? If all you have is a shovel and a wheelbarrow, what kind of resource is a sand deposit in the ground compared to when you have a dump truck and a front-end loader and a bulldozer? Different resource because of the tools you have. So the tools, I forgot to say, if you have a tree out here in nature, that tree has its own intrinsic characteristics, its own reason for being, its own agenda in its life. It's a whole entity. And then we come along and we look at that tree and say, oh, I can get 6 logs out of that, and we make it less than what it was. And it crosses this boundary. Indigenous cultures have asking and thanking rituals to acknowledge this boundary. But in Western culture, oh, do we do that? Not much. Everything is a resource for the taking. Right? But there's this whole point here that there's a double-headed arrow here, because if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The kind of tools you have influence the things you perceive as a resource. The kind of things you perceive as a resource will influence the kind of tools that you design and create and use. These things are interrelated, inseparable. And if you go back and read Permaculture 1, you'll realize that the vast majority of that book is about technology and resources. And the vast majority of what people learn as permaculture is about technology and resources. And if you understand that this is a whole system, culture, and there's 2 other pieces, that dealing with only 2 pieces is dealing with less than half of the system. Because you've got the 4 pieces and you've got the relationships between them all. And it's the relationships that are most important. And that's one of the other central insights of permaculture. It's not the things, it's the relationships between them that's important. So, in the 80s, we started putting a fair amount of attention on this third part. Social and economic structures is what I call it. Many permaculturists call it invisible structures, which really just, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard to me, because it's another piece of pure jargon. It means nothing to the conventional brain. Let's call them what they are, social and economic structures. That actually gives you some sense of what I'm talking about. And if we call them invisible structures, they'll remain what? Invisible. And if you open your eyes, the social and economic structures are not invisible at all. Look at the room. Look at the pattern of the room. Look at the technology in the room. Look at the resources transformed into tools that surround us. And if you look in deeply into that, you will see the culture that we live in. There's no way not to. That is why archaeologists can find tools from ancient societies and make guesses about the whole culture because it's a hologram. You can't separate these parts. And I'll tell you, I've been part of, as a designer and in my own life, I have designed systems where I had all three of these working well together, and they still failed. Because we didn't deal with this piece. And after 33 years of observing the permaculture movement and participating in the permaculture movement, I've noticed that virtually every fail that I've seen in the permaculture movement, the proximate cause of failure is in this realm, social economics. But the essential cause is right here. And I put it in the circle in the center because it's like the DNA of the cell, and that's, well, you could call it a number of things. You could call it cosmology, our belief systems, but it's more than just beliefs. It's our whole worldview. It's our paradigm. It's our inner landscape. And as a designer for 30 years, okay, 30 years ago I was finishing graduate school, my design degree in graduate school. And as a designer for 30 years, I have noticed how my inner landscape and my clients' inner landscapes completely affect the design outcome. Completely. Inseparable. There's a saying in Tantric Yoga that the perceiver, the perceived, and the active perception are one. And if you just take a moment and just look at me and notice your active, witness yourself perceiving me. You can have the experience that there's no separation between you who's looking, the active perception, and me. You can actually experience that in the moment. I've tried it. I try to do it frequently. Well, guess what? The designer, the designed, and the active design are inseparable. They're one. If you want to have an ecological design result, you have to have an ecological design process, and you have to have an ecologist as the designer. No way around it. So this is like the operating instructions. It guides everything. And the double-headed arrows are there because they interrelate. They're one system. The reality is there's no separation, there's no boundaries really here. That's the reality. This is a model to help us understand it, to abstract it, step back, understand, and then dive back into reality with a little more understanding and insight. Okay? But here's a couple quotes I want to share with you that relate to this last piece. Good old Einstein. We cannot solve the significant problems we face at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. That's fairly obvious, right?
It is.
It's very subtle. It goes very deep. The next quote changed my life in 1999. We see things not as they are. We see things as we are. We see things not as they are. We see things as we are. So the question becomes, who do you want to be? What do you want to see? Who do you want to be? What do you want to see? Who do you want to be? What do you want to see? And given that everyone that I can see in this room is a white person, and we live in America, my guess is that we're all weird. Westernized, educated, industrial, rich, and supposedly democratic. All right? Even if you don't feel rich by American standards, the vast majority of us are in the top 1% of the world, economically. So we're rich. We can afford to come here for the day, for God's sake. So that changes the way we see the world. There's no way around that. The more conscious we can be of that, the better off we're all going to be. Now in permaculture, on that inner landscape piece, we talk about the ethics and the principles. Those are fundamental to what permaculture is about. Okay? Ethics are an essential piece of this cosmology. But if you understand anything about philosophy, ethics are only one aspect of what makes a complete philosophy. There's axiology. What are the truisms? What are the axioms that underlie how the culture is put together? And that includes ethics and values and principles and probably some other stuff. Right? In permaculture we have ethics and we have principles. We haven't had a shared agreement or understanding of what our values are in permaculture. We've got a gap there. And then that's just axiology. Then we have ontology and epistemology. Ontology deals with the questions of what is the nature of existence? What's the nature of being? Who am I? And epistemology relates to questions of what are valid ways of knowing anything? Is science the only valid way of knowing anything? Is intuition the only valid way of knowing anything? Are the two combined the only two valid ways of knowing something? What's valid? The I Ching? Pendulum swinging to make decisions? Coin toss? Who won the Kentucky Derby as the determinant of where I should marry someone or not? I mean, what are we using? And all the big arguments in the permaculture movement, if you're paying any attention to the politics of permaculture, if you look at it and think about it, all the big arguments that people are having resolve around values, ontology, and epistemology. We don't all lecture. The first 3 days of the course, we're all there, we're all like, yeah, we need permaculture, we like this, we're psyched, the world's got all these problems, let's go. The first 3 days of the course, Bill Mollison just ranted and raved for 3 solid days, for 10 hours a day, about all the problems of the world. Telling us all the shit that we already knew, and we were all just like, for 3 days. And what I've learned as an educator is that the first 2 days of a long course are like the time when people's sponges are the most ready to accept information. And he spent the first 3 days filling with all this. And so I decided to invent something I call the problem game. Or it evolved, I should say. It's like, how do I address this question of what is the problem while interacting with people and having us all relate to that without dominating and just like having to dominate the whole situation. So what I started doing was we'd spend 10 minutes with an easel and a pad and marker, and we brainstorm for 10 minutes, what are all the problems we're trying to solve? Why do we need permaculture? And we just puke it all out. And I'd write it all down on the paper. And then after 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, I'd say, okay, folks, let's look at the problems that you're all stated. Sexism and pollution and fishery collapse and forest devastation and desertification. Everything was turned to dessert. It wouldn't be bad. And I'd say, okay, of all the things on this board, which things are causes and which things are effects? And I'd write those things up in black, and I'd take a red marker, and we'd cross out the things that people said were effects, and I'd circle the things that people said were causes. And we'd end up with about half the board, say, and I'd say, okay, of the things that you said were causes, which of them are effects and which are causes? And we'd go through that again until we got down to 1 or 2 things that were left on the board. And almost, I think every time, imagine once when it didn't turn out to do it, almost every time I did this, the word or words that were left were things like separation, alienation, disconnection. recreate the Garden of Eden. Well, what's that myth? Adam and Eve are brought into the world by God, and they have this unself-conscious connection. They're unified with the garden. Everything's fine. Food is just there for them. They don't have to kill anything or toil or sweat to make their day's bread. It's wonderful. Infinitile. And then they eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Black-white thinking. And they realize they're separate. They realize, oh, I've got genitals. Woo! And they become separate. And then they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden with an angel with a flaming sword. Ugh! And the story of human evolution since then, cultural evolution, at least in Western culture, is the story of us going from that black-white thinking that actually begins, the terrible twos. You ever heard of those? No! That's separation. That's the kid realizing I'm separate. I can have what I want, and I want what I want, and black-white thinking is a stage that lasts, if you have a healthy child development, it only lasts a few years. But because we have these unhealed traumas, we stop growing emotionally, and we get stuck in right, wrong, good, bad, black, white. And black-white thinking is bad. So here we are at the apex of our adolescence. We've come to the point where we have such incredible power. We can do anything. Put people on the moon, have satellites I can send a text. I can write a text right here, and I can send it to a satellite and have it show up in Lauren's phone right over there. Isn't that cool?
No reception.
Oh, no reception. Now I feel emasculated.
She's truly separated.
Right? So, we're able to dig up mountains to get coal. We're able to ship cotton from Mississippi to Indonesia to get spun into thread, and ship it from there to Bangladesh to get made into a t-shirt, and then have it shipped back here and only have to spend $5 to buy it. We're incredible creatures. Like, holy moly, look at what we've done. I have this little device in my hand that I can move this thing over here. It's crazy. We're very powerful and completely immature. And I don't want to go back to the Garden of Eden, back to that unself-conscious, infantile union that I had as an infant. I want to go forward into union, interdependent, aware, adult integrity and union with the world, with my partner, with my community, with my species, with other species. That's about becoming mature adults, not suckling at the breast. Right? The paradigm that we are separate from nature effectively is about self-separation. We're separating ourselves from ourselves. And that self-separation, I've watched inside myself. I've watched it in other people. It shows up as self-hatred. Look at what we're doing to the planet, folks. If that's not self-hatred, what is it? Can we own our self-hatred? Can we be honest about that? Can we feel it and deal with it, please? Because by not feeling it and dealing with it, we're pushing it and projecting it outward. And that's what's causing the problems. We're separating our emotions from ourselves and putting them elsewhere where they don't belong. And And that self-separation paradigm keeps reasserting itself. It keeps reasserting itself and keeps reasserting itself until you get down to the very, very root of it. I hope. So again, here we are. The structure of the reality we face is forcing us, it's calling to us, it's begging to us to understand true unity. Not some pie-in-the-sky spiritual woo-woo kind of shit. Real, ecological, groundbreaking, ground-healing unity, integrity, interconnection. And if we truly understand ecological principles and apply them to our lives, we'll get there. On the emotional level and the practical physical level. And if we don't get there on the emotional level, we won't get there on the practical physical level. So here's the paradigm shift, folks. Bill Mollison famously once said, permaculture is about working with nature, not against her, which sounds great, right? But it's still coming from the separation paradigm. I'm working with nature, but she's standing over here. I'm working with her. I'm separate from her. Hetty Livingston Stark realized that, and she said to herself, what would it sound like to say the same thing that Mollison said from the paradigm that humans and nature are one system? We are nature working. It's only 4 words, but it's much more elegant, truer. We are nature working. We are nature learning. We are nature eating. We are nature sleeping. We are nature pooping. We are nature making love. We are nature learning. So, you could say, God got us, all it is has become nature, nature has become us. And then who are we? Are we God's children? Are we adolescents? Are we techno-monkeys? I mean, look at the similarity of posture there, folks. Ecologically, who are we? I would argue that we are like the salmon and the mountain lion and the alligator. Salmon, they're the keystone of the arch. They spawn in the river, they go downstream, they grow and live in the ocean, accumulating all kinds of nutrients from the ocean. They swim back upstream. They spawn, they die, most of them. They get eaten by bears and raccoons and whatever else, and those nutrients from the ocean get spread all over the watershed. Every year, tons upon tons upon tons, which fertilizes the whole watershed. And that hasn't been happening for a few hundred years. The health and the behavior and the population of every other species in that ecosystem is dependent upon the salmon. They're the keystone species. Top predators. Amazing. You know, they had all these problems with the vegetation in Yellowstone National Park. There are no wolves. The elk were spending all their time down in the river valleys where the vegetation was the most succulent, and overgrazing, overbrowsing down there, and then all the vegetation up on the hills was overgrowing because it wasn't getting browsed. They brought the wolves back in, and the erosion stopped. The pattern of the animals on the elk on the landscape changed, and there was regrowth in the valleys and browsing in the hills, and all kinds of things changed. Bird species changed. Everything changed because the top predator came back. Alligators need to stay wet. The alligators in the Everglades dig alligator holes to stay wet during the dry season. That creates a place where there's a concentration of water that attracts All the other animals that need water go there to get water because it's there. Otherwise, they'd be in trouble. And as payment, a few of them get grabbed here and there. But the chances are low. That's why they take the risk to drink. Because they're not always going to get eaten. Right? And that creates a whole change in the hydrology and the physical structure of the ecosystem. So you've got alligator holes that are recent, ones that have been abandoned are going through succession. You've got different vegetation communities, patch by patch by patch. It's all different, and that is what made the Everglades the rich ecosystem that it was. And without the alligators, it would decline seriously. Is there any species besides us that is the most keystone species of the planet? Is there anyone else that you would contend would be the keystone species of planet Earth right now? Humans. Earthworms aren't everywhere. We affect every species, even in the penguins. They have DDT in their fat.
Some kind of bacteria.
Right? Maybe some bacteria. Yep. Pardon? Mycelium, perhaps. Yep. But we're certainly up there as one of the keystones. We are a keystone. Our actions and our population size and our behavior affect every other species on the planet. And we can try and shrink from that role and make ourselves smaller. And oh, I'm so bad, and I better make my footprint even smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that still won't change the fact that we're a keystone species. We simply have to master our role, folks. Yeah, decrease your footprint, but increase your handprint. Right? Decrease your footprint, increase your handprint. That means that our needs and our role are valid, and denial and self-hatred are not going to serve anyone. It won't serve any other species on the planet for us to be in denial of our role and to be self-hating about it. It's not going to serve us. It's not going to serve our friends. It's not going to serve other species. So the question then becomes, how can we best serve? And the idea of service, I think, is critical. Because service, in many spiritual traditions, is a spiritual practice. We learn by serving. Well, how might we best serve? How might we frame our work? If we frame it as ecological culture design of human cultural systems that mimic natural ecosystems, I think we're going to get a lot of benefits. What is mimicry? Someone hand me that water bottle back there, please. Mimicry is the close external or functional resemblance of one species, element, or system to another. In ecosystems, mimicry evolves as a way to gain an adaptive advantage. The best example that people most know is the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies live on milkweeds. Milkweeds contain cardiac glycosides. The insect ingests and stores the cardiac glycosides so that the butterfly becomes toxic to its main predators, which are vertebrates. Cardiac glycosides, if there's enough of them, can stop a vertebrate heart. So a bird eats the butterfly, and its heart goes, oh, and it doesn't taste very good either. And so the bird goes, oh, what was that? And, oh, bright orange and black wings. I remember that. I'm never going to eat that again. Right? That's what the orange and black wings evolved for, to help them be able to identify that. They call it warning coloration in ecology. Right? They're warning the predator, do not eat me. Well, once you have one species that has that adaptive advantage, it's not getting eaten by birds very much, you have that species in the ecosystem, then it's to the advantage of other species that look like that. And so the viceroy butterfly evolved. It's a smaller butterfly. They eat only aspen leaves. They're completely edible by birds, but they look like the monarch, and so they don't get eaten as much. That's mimicry. But notice who's the monarch and who's the viceroy. All right? Nature is our monarch. We are subservient. We are the viceroys. So, by mimicking nature in the way we design our cultures, we remember ourselves as part of nature. We always have been part of nature. We've never been separate, but we remember that. And we become better members of that system by mimicking nature. And of course, we're nature as humans, and so we have our own unique needs and qualities that we need to understand and embody and express in the way we live. Because we're not an elk or a bacteria. And so we need to honor that. But the mimicry will teach us a lot. The implications of that frame for what we're doing is that we are nature remembering, and that the landscape design and agricultural part of permaculture is the foundation of our work, but not the whole. That doing that on-the-ground work and embodying the ecological principles in that form teaches us how nature works, because we get direct feedback from the landscape about how we're doing. Have you learned to let go of control yet? Have you learned to let go of control yet? Are you observant enough yet? Do you know what you're doing yet? And once we get that part down, which, feeds us and clothes us and houses us, gets our basic needs met, then we can take what we learned from that work and apply it in much more abstract, challenging circumstances like the design of human social structures and the inner landscape. Right? So the agriculture part of permaculture is just the beginning. It's foundational, but it's only the beginning. What are we mimicking? I would argue that we have 4 primary essential things that we're mimicking from nature in our design work, whatever we're designing. And this I have not yet written this up, so you're only seeing this here. All right? The 4 P's: properties, principles, patterns, and processes. The properties are the aims, our design goals. We want our designs to have the properties that ecosystems have, self-maintenance and so on. Principles are strategies that ecosystems use to cause those properties to appear. The patterns and the processes are the structure and function of the actual ecosystem that we're going to actually mimic and draw from as models. I want to talk about each of these in turn. The properties are things like stability, resilience, self-maintenance, self-regulation, self-renewal, self-fertilization, production of clean air and clean water, increase of water storage capacity, biodiversity, and soil quality over time. I would like to have a garden that has those qualities, would not you? Right? I can tell you, and my books, Edible Forest Gardens, gives you the information you need to actually design systems that embody these qualities. I can tell you clearly, theoretically, and practically how to do that. Okay? And I say at the bottom, a good enough start, because there's a whole bunch of other ecosystem properties that we might desire, but I'm not sure how to tell you how to design those. And my guess is that if you can design a system that has these, the other ones will come along for the ride because they come as a package deal. It's how systems operate, with maybe a few exceptions. But the key point here, too, is that these properties are emergent properties. They only emerge from the dynamics between the elements composing the system. No individual element, a tree or a plant or a bird, can cause these qualities to arise in an ecosystem by themselves. It's only the relationship between them that makes them arise. And so they emerge from the system as a whole. And most of us have not been trained to see and think that way. It's like my ability to stand here, know what's on the screen, look around the room, modulate the volume of my voice, hold on to this clicker without dropping it and not fall over. Those are emergent properties of my lungs, my heart, my sinews, my bones. All these different elements that compose my body-mind. And no one of those elements can do those behaviors by themselves. We are all comprised of and expressive of emergent properties and surrounded by them, but we're usually not aware of them very well. principles are the strategies that make those ecosystem properties arise. If you think about natural systems have these ways of being that we're trying to observe and discern, and we can put them in a pithy statement like one sentence, and that is what we call a principle. But remember that is us deriving that from observation. That's our take. It's not necessarily the reality. The map's not the territory. But the closer our maps get to the territory, in terms of the principles, the better off we're going to be. And the more true a principle is, the more applicable it is. And those principles are at the foundation of what ecological design is about. And I want us all to be aware that the way we state those principles, the specific words we use, changes our understanding. And there's a lot of different people listing a lot of different principles out in the permaculture movement, and I want to encourage you to throw them all out. Or maybe not throw them all out, but test every one of them against your own life to determine which ones actually are true for you, and restate them in your own words so that they get more and more clear over time. This is what I've done for 30 years. Actually, more than 30 years. And you can, trust whoever you want on that, but test. As Reagan said, trust but verify. Right? And then we have the pattern and process, the structure and function. And in my book, I talk about these 4 elements of forest ecosystem pattern and process: the physical architecture, the social structure, the structure of self-renewing fertility, and the succession patterns of natural forest ecosystems. And then we're trying to understand how those operate and draw the elements of those that work for us. We're not trying to imitate, we're mimicking. We're trying to draw what's useful to us from nature. Right? Imitation is different from mimicry. We don't want to be the forest, we want to be like the forest. I don't want to be Beyonce, I want to be like her. Am I doing well on that by any chance?
The less clothing part.
So, I want to go dive a bit more deeply into the social structure piece. My time is, I'm an hour in, I'm supposed to get another 15 minutes. I'm not sure I'm going to make it in 15 minutes, but I want to dive into some deep science here. So we can go below the surface into some real intense stuff, and then come back out, and I think you'll have a deeper appreciation for what I'm talking about here when we're done. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Or I can stop right now.
No, go for it.
Good. I was expecting you to answer that way. All right. So when we're designing a forest garden, our model, at least in this region, at least further south from here, is the healthy temperate deciduous forest, right? And studies that I found about the species richness of healthy temperate deciduous forests show that we have 10 to 18 tree species in the canopy per tenth of a hectare. A tenth of a hectare is about a quarter acre or 100 by 100 feet. So 10 to 18 trees in 100 by 100. That's very high diversity. And those trees have small canopies on average. Shrub layer, 10 species in a tenth of a hectare. Also very high diversity in a healthy temperate deciduous forest. Herb layer, 14 species per square yard, 35 to 40 per habitat. How many people here have ever seen a healthy temperate deciduous forest that has that much herb layer diversity? Raise your hand. All right, 2 of us that I can see. That means, folks, I'm sorry to say that the vast majority of us have never seen a healthy temperate deciduous forest. You have only seen damaged or sick forest. You don't even know what your model looks like. Sorry. But what we're trying to do is mimic that level of diversity in a forest garden with species that they have never grown together before. Because we're using species from all over the world that we want to eat. We got to learn how to do that. That's not a simple proposition. This quote will help us get there. Ecological communities are not as tightly linked as organisms, but neither are they simply collections of individuals. Rather, the community is a unique form of biological system in which the individuality of the parts paradoxically acts to bind the system together. That's super clear to you, right?
Right.
By the end of this talk, I think it will be. This second sentence is the key, and we'll get there. We start by looking at the species themselves and what are their multiple interactions between their environment. This is where the principle of multiple functions comes from, people. The principle of multiple functions, that every design element should have more than one function, is derived from the observation that everything in nature does have more than one function. So if we're thinking it's only a single function thing, we're not being ecological. And by having that design principle, it opens our eyes to all those different possibilities and leads us to do what I call niche analysis and really understand what are the different contexts, predators, allies, needs, tolerances, preferences, characteristics, products, functions, behaviors, and core strategies of the species we're dealing with, or even if it's a rock. A boulder lying on the ground, it has multiple interactions with its environment. It's got color, it reflects some wavelengths of light, it absorbs other, it absorbs heat and holds heat for different lengths of time depending on the kind of stone it is, etc., etc., etc. What's the mineral content, what's washing off of that stone? Those are all part of the multiple functions of a rock. Right? And so we design our process has to help us to understand. If we're going to have an ecological result, we have to understand the ecology of the species that we're dealing with, or the elements that we're dealing with. Mollison calls this needs and yields analysis, but it goes beyond needs and yields alone. It's all different kinds of parameters that we can look at. All right, that's the species niche, or niche. We are the nice who say niche, and we demand a shrubbery. Alright, that's the species niche. Then we have the community niche. A community niche, if you analyze it, has the same basic information that you find in the species niche, but it's looking at it from the perspective of the community. And you can think about it, in summary, as like a job role. In a village, you need the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the police officer, the postal worker, etc. Right? In order to be a functional village, there's certain roles, certain functions that have to be performed, certain community niches that have to be filled. Community niche is about function. So if you plant a mast-producing or nut-producing canopy tree, you're going to have canopy herbivores because you build it and they will come. And so you want to make sure you have canopy herbivore predators. And in the ideal world, you're going to have that one niche of canopy herbivore predator, you're going to have the principle of redundancy principle. You're going to have multiple species filling that niche. And it could be bacteria, birds, fungi, tree frogs, humans, insects, whatever. But you want to have multiple species filling that niche so that you know that that function of canopy herbivore predator will be filled. That's ecosystem design. When you look at community niches, you say, okay, we have these functions that need to be performed, and we want to have redundancy. That means you're going to have a set of species that are filling that function, and that's what I call a community function guild. Now, I need to make an aside here, which I wish I didn't have to make this aside, but I do, because there's recently been a book out on called Integrated Forest Gardening that came out this last month. Other people in the permaculture movement have written about guilds and polycultures, mostly about guilds, and their framing of what a guild is really terrible. I'm sorry to say this, but most of what you've learned, if you've taken a course from people who haven't learned from me, I'm so great. The understanding of what a guild is really fuzzy. I was confused by what Mollison wrote for years. I could never understand it. I just didn't even deal with it. But when I was writing Edible Forest Gardens, I said, okay, I've got to look into this. So I went back to ground in the science of ecology, and what I discovered was that the one-word guild was being used by scientists in the science of ecology to describe different things. And this is partly why Mollison was confused, I think. And so I looked into all the different examples of the word guild in the science of ecology that I could find, and I discovered initially I figured out 2 different kinds of guilds that they were talking about. And since my book has been published, I figured out a 3rd, and that's this one. Okay, so this is not in my book, and you're not going to hear about it from anyone but me or someone who's learned from me. But I think what's critical here is that the way we frame these concepts will affect how we observe and how we design. And so I want to be really clear as I can be with my language about what it is we're doing and what we're observing. And what I've found is that scientists have used, my clicker out, thank you. Scientists have used the word guild to denote a set of species in an ecosystem that are performing the same function for the community. Therefore, they are filling the same community niche. They are a community function guild. Right? So, this adjectival phrase, to get you back to your elementary school grammar, modifies the word guild and it makes clear what I'm talking about. It's a guild, it's like the plumbers guild. Plumbers all do plumbing. They have the same niche in a community. Right? And they get organized and they take care of their business and they make sure that we all have to use them by law. Right? That's what guilds do. This kind of guild. So, we have 4 different kinds of community function guilds. It's like the the Spanish Inquisition, right? 4, 3. There's another one on the next slide. You've got crop guilds. We're part of the ecosystem. We have to design systems that have food for us. That's a community function guild that we need to design into our gardens. We have to analyze their season of yield, the kinds of crops, fruit, nut, whatever, protein yielding crops, vitamin yielding crops, etc., various minerals or whatever, and what site conditions. In order to design that guild, we have to look at at least those 3 things. The ground covers. Their function is to cover the ground and limit weeds so we can direct succession the way we want it to go. You need to understand, you want to try and have runners, clumpers, and mat formers in that guild. You want to have understanding of their density, height, the rate of growth, their site conditions, and whether they're foot tolerant or not. Right? That's how you design, those are the factors for helping you design a functional ground cover guild. Soil improvements, what nutrients do they gather? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, whatever. Depth of rooting, site conditions. And then we have your nectar plants for beneficial insects. And you want to know what time of year they flower. Because if you have all of your specialist nectar plants flowering only in the springtime, they're going to go elsewhere the rest of the year, and then you're not going to have their services. So you've got to design that guild so that function is being performed throughout the whole growing season. That's what a community function guild is. And we've got, fruits and nuts and greens and shoots and roots and culinary tea crops and mushrooms. Those are the things we might look at as kinds of crops to grow. But there's 2 more kinds of guilds. These are the ones that I write about in Volume 1 of my book. The Resource Partitioning Guild and the Mutual Support Guild. And the words help you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about, I hope. All right? This is a diagram from John Weaver's work in the 19-teens. He was one of the first American plant ecologists. They spent 4 years digging up 1,400 native prairie plants, sometimes digging up to 20 feet deep into clay to make accurate maps of the root system structures of these different species with multiple repetitions for each species. And what they found was that half of the prairie native plants had their main absorbing roots of 5 to 7 feet below the surface, a quarter had their main absorbing roots of 2 to 5 feet, and a quarter had their main absorbing roots of the top 2 feet of soil. They were partitioning a scarce resource to avoid competition. That scarce resource was not soil, because in those days, the topsoil was 6 to 7 feet deep. It's only 6 inches on average by now. They were partitioning water because they get 10 to 20 inches of water a year there. And the plants that had the deepest root systems were green all summer. The plants with the shallow root systems were dormant in the summertime and green in spring and fall. And by having a resource partitioning guild in that way, they reduced competition, which is a reduction of stress for all the species involved. You get higher diversity, and you get higher ecosystem productivity. These are properties, emergent properties we want. And resource partitioning guilds cause those properties to emerge. Right? The community function guild helps you get stability of yield. That's one of the things we want too. All right, we can do this with trees. We have tap-rooted trees, including my legs and torso. We have heart-rooted trees, which spread down and out from the crown. And we have flat-rooted trees, ignore my torso and legs. Right? And you can imagine if you only plant flat-rooted trees in your garden, you're going to maximize competition, but if you mix it up, you'll minimize competition. That's what we're talking about. That's why in the back of volume 2 of my book, we have 625 plant species in the appendix there, and we have root pattern information for about half of those. We dug up as much as we could for you. Right? So to speak, yeah. You can partition sunlight. You can partition nitrogen. You can partition water. You can partition root space. You can partition nectar timing and pollination services. Pollination services are actually one of the things that is often limiting in ecosystems. And if you have everything flowering at once and nothing flowering the rest of the year, the pollinators won't be able to pollinate everything when it's flowering because they can't build a population up and keep it high enough to pollinate everything. And then they're going to have no nectar for the rest of the year. They'll die out. Right? So we have to partition the pollination resources, among many other things. If you have ever lived in a group home with one bathroom, you've learned how to partition that bathroom resource. Or you've had conflicts, or both. All right, so that's the resource partition guild. The mutual function guild, the mutual support guild, is about functional interconnection. All right, this is the principle of functional interconnection. Says that functional interconnection occurs when the inherent yields of one design element are being met by the inherent needs. The inherent needs of one element are being met by the inherent yields of another element. So I have an itch in my back. You've got a fingernail. Right? That's functional interconnection. When you have functional interconnection, you get mutual support webs that build stability and harmony. Why? Because the needs are all getting met. If your needs are met, you're getting more stable and more harmonious. And you reduce stress and work and waste and pollution because stress would be not one way of having stress is not having your needs met. Work is caused by the needs of, say, a pear tree. Pear tree needs calcium. It doesn't have calcium accumulated plants in its root zone, so you have to do the work to provide calcium. Right? That's work. Waste and pollution are caused by yields that are not being used as a resource by someone else. Right? So functional interconnection is essential to this. The best example I have of this comes from California. Vineyards in California. Did you know they grow grapes in California? Some of the vineyards had problems with an insect called the grape leafhopper. The grape leafhopper, if too many of the leafhoppers, they eat too much of the leaves, they don't get a good yield on their grapes. But not all the vineyards had this leafhopper in enough abundance to cause economic harm to the vineyards. They called University of California entomologists to come in and figure out why. Well, it turns out that some vineyards had high populations of this little tiny wasp. This is sitting on a grape leaf. That's sitting on a grape leaf. You can see the wasp is way smaller than that. And that wasp controls the population of the grape leafhoppers. So why do some vineyards have this wasp in abundance and others don't? They did more research. It turns out that raspberries also have leafhoppers. Raspberries leaf out before grapes in the growing season. The raspberry leafhoppers come out before the grape leafhoppers. The Anagris epos can increase its population on the raspberry leafhoppers, get their population to a point where they can control the population of the grape leafhoppers and stop harm to the grape growers. That's a mutual support guild. The raspberries, the wasp, and the raspberry leafhoppers are supporting the grapes. And chances are that because there's a leafhopper on the grapes later in the season than the raspberries, and there's probably a leafhopper on some other species after the grape leafhopper, that these other species are keeping the population of the wasp high enough that they can overwinter in numbers high enough to control the raspberry leafhoppers. So what goes around comes around. Right? That's mutual support. And can you see how these three kinds of guilds are different from each other in terms of the relationship between the species? That's critical. Right, but here's the kicker, folks. This mutual support guild of these 5 species, I don't have the raspberry leafhopper on here, This can function as a guild when the raspberries and the grapes are as far as 4 miles away from each other. Because the wasps can fly. This is not a polyculture. Alright? A polyculture is the opposite of monoculture. A monoculture is when you have one species growing in a patch of ground and that's it. A polyculture simply means you have more than one species. It can be a biculture, 2 species, or a triculture, 3 species, or go on from there. It's a polyculture. That's all a polyculture is that there's more than one species. It doesn't mean it's a good polyculture or a bad polyculture. It may not stay a polyculture for long because the one species may outcompete all the others to extinction in that patch. And then it'll become a monoculture. Right? So not all guilds are polycultures, but all effective polycultures are going to be composed of guilds. If you look at the 3 sisters, the corn, beans, and squash of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, it's a polyculture of 3 species, but I have identified 13 different guilds among those 3 species. 13 guild relationships. Both mutual support and functional interconnection and resource petitioning and community function guilds. All 3 of those. 13 different guild relationships. And I don't really have time to go into detail on that. But let me give you a couple of examples. You know the beans climb on the corn. That's mutual support. That's part of a mutual support guild. Right? The one that most people don't know is one that I figured out by experimenting with a different polyculture that is modeled on this. And that's that when you have any object in the sun, that object will make 2 shadows. One that spreads wide and is not very dark, and one that converges that's dark. And when we have a solar eclipse, the moon, the converging dark shadow, wherever that touches the Earth, that's where you see a full solar eclipse, right? But if you're outside of that zone, you're still getting a partial eclipse, and you're in that shadow of the wider, the dimmer shadow, or the brighter shadow, I should say. Well, the leaves of corn and the leaves of beans and the leaves of squash have both kinds of shadows too. And corn is a narrow leaf. And so that dark shadow converges to extinguishment in a short vertical distance. So it's not shading the beans very much. And the beans have a compound leaf, not a big, fat, wide leaf like squash. And so each one of those leaflets, that shadow converges and disappears in a short vertical distance also. So the corn and the beans are partitioning light. Whereas the squash has these big leaves that cast a deep shadow and is closer to the ground, and that's for weed control. And you want that, right? Just by virtue of having 3 species that have at least 13 guild relationships built into that polyculture, you get a higher yield. Study Cornell, they took a cornfield that had been consistent soil throughout the whole field. They divided it in half. They planted corn only on one side, corn, beans, and squash on the other side. 17% more calories per acre just from having a polyculture. Same fertilizer regime, etc. Right? 17% more calories. Now, if you're a subsistence culture and you're dependent on this for your calories over the wintertime, what's 17% of 6 months? All right, you got 365 days in a year. 6 months is 180 days. 17% is 18 plus 18 days plus 7 would be about, call it another 12 days or something. That's 30 days. More calories, perhaps. And that can make the difference between starving for a month or not. Just from having a polyculture. And that's the kind of system we want to design in a forest garden. And in an annual garden, for that matter. Right? And in order to do that, we have to design the guilds. And if we understand guilds the way I'm talking about, we're going to be better at observing and figuring those relationships out in such a way that we can design them more effectively. That's my argument. We can take this polyculture of corn, bean, and squash, and we can make a perennial mimic of it. Perennial three sisters, or the three brothers, maybe. Jerusalem artichoke being the corn analog, big tall plant. Makes really large quantities of tubers, quite tasty edible tubers, great for diabetics. Groundnut, Apios americana, an herbaceous, leguminous, perennial vine that also produces edible tubers that are higher in protein and minerals than potatoes. And we now have cultivars that are fist-sized and larger. Bean analog. We have used this species here, Stachys affinis, as the squash analog, as the ground cover. Stachys affinis is generally called Chinese artichoke, but the folks that I know in the permaculture movement in Western Mass, we're calling it mint root now, because it's in the mint family, and it has a little edible tuber that looks kind of like the Michelin Man. That's not really worth going and harvesting for itself, but if you're in there harvesting other tubers, you get the extra yield of that. It's great, and it attracts beneficial insects. It's a good ground cover. It's a decent ground cover. But we've had problems with this polyculture, and it's actually experimenting with this polyculture to help me understand the partitioning of light between the corn and the bean. Because look at the size of that leaf. Look at the depth of shadow on that leaf, right? It takes 2 years to get sizable yields on this, whereas you can get sizable yields on this in the first year. So now I'm looking for narrow-leaf cultivars of Jerusalem artichoke, which should increase the yield of that. Which brings up a whole other point. Most of the crops that we grow have not been bred for polyculture. They're bred for monocultures. And the native peoples bred for polycultures. And they have very complex polycultures they bred for. And the Abenaki of Vermont and New Hampshire, they've recovered 26 of their native cultivars. And they're trying to recreate their culture through their seed. And they're finding some very interesting things out about it, which I'm hoping to explore later this fall. I made a connection with an Abenaki elder who's also a PhD ecologist at the Quebec Permaculture Convergence last month. And he's very cool, and he's doing very cool work, and I'm very excited about what they're doing. So I hope this is a little clearer now. The community is a unique form of biological system in which the individuality of the parts acts paradoxically to bind the system together. Corn, beans, and squash are very different from each other. They're not similar at all. But it's that difference between them that allows them to interact in such a way that they work together as a system. They can functionally interconnect, partition resources, and fill community niches. And that's true of us too. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. We are nature working. The principles of ecology apply to us. There's no reason to have a different phrase for a human-designed system versus a natural ecosystem. This is one of the beefs I have with the way Toby Hemingway has defined guilds and polyculture, because he says a guild is a human-designed polyculture, and a polyculture is a natural polyculture. And that just continues a separation mindset. That's bullshit. Right? There's no separation, then the principles apply across the board. And we should apply them equally by the same name to ourselves and our systems as we do to nature. That's my take. But it's our individuality, our uniqueness, that will bind us together if we can understand, if we can communicate, if we can be honest about our own reality and what our qualities are, and about each other's qualities, without judgment, with respect. Then we can figure out how to work together in a functional way, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we have to do that across our whole culture, our whole social and economic structure. When we do that in our social and economic structure, then we'll be well on our way to having an ecological culture. And the garden can teach us how to do that. So here's my question. Are we recreating the Garden of Eden? Or does Eden arise naturally as an emergent system property. That shift of frame is huge, people. I'm going to go recreate Eden. Ha ha! No. It's not egoic like that at all. We're not in control here. We're part. We have a key role to play, but we're only a part. And if Eden's really going to arise, we have to be here to be of service to larger systems than ourselves. Remember that when we picture the energy climax as a spectacular but dangerous mountain peak that we, humanity, have succeeded in climbing, the idea of a descent to safety is a sensible and attractive proposition. And we're always designing cultural systems whether we know it or not. Everything interconnects. Every choice is a cultural choice. Every choice is an ecosystem choice. And at its core, the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Thank you.